Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Today, I welcome back to the show my good friend, the Carnivore MD, none other than Paul Saladino. He finally moved to Austin. I convinced him after a couple months of lobbying, and we sat down in his yard, chatted all the things that he's doing recently and all the things he's diving into. So why he is eating carbohydrates. So carnivore guy eating, about 100, 150 grams of carbs a day. Why is that? How is he feeling? And all the way down to everything that he's changing around how he actually eats his breakfast, lunch, and dinner, what he made me for dinner not too long ago, and a whole bunch of other stuff like polyunsaturated fatty acids and how to look at labs to assess your cardiovascular risk. So tons of action in this one. He is also launching the second edition of his book called The Carnivore Code alongside a brand new project called Heart and Soil, which is a bunch of grass-fed organ meat products you can find at heartandsoilsupplements.com. So always good info from Paul. Glad to have him back on the show, and I hope you guys enjoy. This show is brought to you by Alitura Naturals. When I considered sponsors for this show, I reached out to Andy, who is the founder of Alitura, and pretty much begged him to support the show just because they are the only products that I trust to put on my skin. So much garbage is in skincare products that it blows my mind. I cannot find any other products. I do not put anything else on my body other than Alitura. It's actually a lie. I use White Oak Pasture's beef tallow soap in the shower, but other than that, everything sort of pre-post around that is Alitura. And if you don't know why, your skin is the largest organ in your body. It absorbs everything you put on it. And men are less known for using sort of skincare products, but women average over 250 chemicals that are in their bloodstream from their skincare products by the time they walk out the door in the morning. That is ridiculous. I personally use the moisturizer, the clay mask in my sauna, and the Pearl cleanser. My fiance uses way more. She has a little bit more of a skincare routine than I. And the products themselves are made with the highest end ingredients that you would ever find in skincare products. This stuff's incredible. Andy himself is a testament how these products work. He's been on the podcast before to tell his story, but it was amazing. He was in a horrific accident. His face got all mangled up, and he basically made this formula to heal his scars, and he is now a male model. That is not a joke. He has incredible skin and is obsessed with the quality of his ingredients and the sourcing of them. He was just in Hawaii recently sourcing one ingredient of the many that are in one of his products. This guy goes, visits every single farm and product, and it is incredible. The quality you get here is by far the best in the industry. And so I begged him to sponsor the show and also begged him to give you guys a little bit of a hookup. So if you use code AG20, you'll get 20% off in free shipping over at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA to get 20% off your order at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA.com. You'll get 20% off in free shipping of your entire order. Again, I use the Pearl cleanser. I use the Pearl cleanser and the moisturizer. They are phenomenal. This episode of the Natural State Podcast is brought to you by Sigmatic. Sigmatic is my favorite purveyor of all things mushrooms and adaptogens. Not sure why these things are important? Well, you can start with my episode I did with Sigmatic founder Tara on this subject, but just understand that mushrooms are not part of either animal or plant kingdom. They have unique health properties that are very, very well researched. Everything between boosting mental clarity all the way to naturally supporting the immune system, which I'm sure is something that everybody cares about these days. Also, Sigmatic products have been stocked in our kitchen at the Perfect Keto offices for years now and are probably the second most consumed product next to our own. Their most popular product of coffee mixed with chaga, cordyceps, lion's mane mushrooms, etc., everything to basically take the jitter away from coffee and add a lot of brain boosting elements, is the fan favorite at the office, and it keeps everyone powered through long days without crashing, like they probably would if they had an IV drip of cold brew like most other startups do. Alas, I have been off of caffeine for the last 6 months or so. I've been trying to give my body a rest and recover and get my nervous system back to a point where it's not always thinking it's getting chased by a lion. So what I've been doing is I've been using their adaptogen powder, which has 10 different mushrooms, roots, leaves, berries, and superfoods, with their mushroom blend that has another 10 different types of mushrooms every day for the last 6 months or so. And I've actually personally seen a huge improvement in my HRV, stress levels, recovery, etc. If I'm facing down a really big work day, I actually added an extra packet of both their lion's mane and cordyceps and mix all of that together with a scoop of very exogenous ketones, and it lights my brain up like nothing else can. I've asked the team at Four Sigmatic to hook you guys up, and so they're giving all listeners of the Natural State podcast 15% off of your Four Sigmatic order. Just go to foursigmatic.com/AG15 or enter code AG15, that's AG15 at checkout. That is FOURSIGMATIC.com/AG15 to receive 15% off your order. Paul, welcome to Austin.
It's so good to be here, man. It's so good to be here. Here we are. People can't see us. I still think you should do videos for your podcast.
I know, it's just a pain in the ass sometimes.
You're a handsome fellow, and many of your guests are as well. All of your guests are, I'm sure, handsome fellows and beautiful women. But we're sitting in my backyard in Austin, and it's a good day, man. We're just hanging out outside.
Yeah. Any initial reflections since being here? I don't know, is it months now?
It's almost a month and a half.
Time flies.
It is. And you and I were talking about this, as so often happens when we get together or I get together with other people in my life before the podcast. There's all sorts of gold before the podcast. You and I were talking about community. And one of the reasons I moved here was for my idea of community, an ideal of community. Where do I find people who are like-minded? And you and I were rapping about this prior, and this idea that community is not just being around people who do the same things as you, but who share the same values and beliefs. And so it's been really cool. I've been really fortunate. You've introduced me to some good people like Eric at Ocean Lab. And there are a lot of good people in Austin who I'm finding it very easy to share ideas and values and beliefs with. And that's making it a really valuable, a really quality experience so far.
Yeah. And I think that at least living in San Francisco, when I lived there, there was so much industry focus on startups that you get a very narrow-minded thought process, as well as, I mean, it's just one of the most expensive cities in the world. So you can't have people just doing random interesting things or whatever they're passionate about. And here's sort of like this middle ground between, like, you have a lot of the tech stuff, you have a lot of startup stuff, but you also have really rural stuff. I have friends who own ranches around here. You just get a really great mix of people and mindsets, and you don't go too far either way. And so I think it's like available for people to have a high quality life and come here and move here, kind of people, and sort of like make their own little circles, which has been phenomenal.
Yeah, you think about it. Rome Ranch is here outside. There's other good ranches. And yet in the city, 20 miles away, or in the case of Rome, 60 or 70 miles away, we have people doing startups and other tech stuff. And there's people connecting with the land and all sorts of things happening here. It's very heterogeneous in a lot of ways. And I think that's good because there's value in all of it, right? I mean, what Katie and Taylor are doing it at Rome is incredible. And that's no less valuable than a tech startup. It's equally sort of new and challenging to the status quo and creative, and equally challenging to our ideas at large, spurring us toward new growth in so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's been amazing to get outside of San Francisco, where I think that if you weren't trying to change the world with an app, you were sort of worthless. And here people can be a craftsman in anything that they do, as long as they're sort of like putting themselves out there and improving and working on themselves and stressing themselves in certain ways. Like, that is sort of like the difference I see here for sure. Is, people pick something that they're interested in, they're passionate about, and then they can chase it. And that comes together in a very different way than a sort of a homogenized city like San Francisco.
Like a tech focus as opposed to just an overall quality focus, like Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Right. What's this?
Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You ever read that book? Oh, it's a great book by Robert Pirsig. He was a professor at Montana State, I think. Classic book. I'll have to get it for you. But what I took away from it when I read it 20 years ago was just that he was obsessed with the word quality. Oh, Jesus.
Well, we just almost witnessed a truck take out one of the beautiful trees here.
Wow.
That was wild.
And your car was over there, and I was like, oh boy.
That was startling.
Startling.
That's why, yeah. You get all the action live here.
live action tree trauma.
So yeah, if anybody out there thinks that this is something that they care about, come move to Austin. We're trying to build also a health hub here. So people who care about health is sort of the most important thing. We've talked about this a lot in the last couple of weeks. Sort of like we think that is the most important thing for life because this is how you experience reality. And so we really want to build a community of people here who care about the same stuff. We're also trying to do things. So sounds interesting. Come on down.
And there's a focus, and you can do whatever you like here, and quality will be rewarded, or at least that's the hope, that if you're doing something intentionally and mindfully and with focus, you will do it with quality, whether that's crafting knives or leather belts or a farm or regenerative agriculture or Teslas, if Elon moves here with his factory, or podcasting or writing books. But that's what Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is about, that it's not about what you do. It's about the quality with which you do it. And that you can go to like suburbia and see someone's lawn and their fence, and it's they've put attention and mindfulness into it, and it can be high quality. You can see the difference between something that's high quality and low quality. We all know this, but that was something he was fascinated about. And the idea that he was advocating for was do as much as you can in your life with quality. And it's really just mindful intention around it.
What was this quote? How you do anything is how you do everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that.
Exactly.
So yeah, this is, I guess, our Austin pitch. I mean, the city has endorsed us. The city is brought to you, or this podcast is brought to you by the city of Austin, Texas.
We may or may not be running for city council. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be awesome. I think that we should certainly get some people. Mayor.
Yeah.
Anyone's down for mayor, come, we'll support you.
City council, make it a really good place. Lots of cool people moving here. But
yeah, so you're still carnivore freak, obviously. Not necessarily freak, but you still do things, I think, in a non-traditional way.
I do things in a non-traditional way.
Which I like because it always makes for interesting conversations. And I was over here a couple of weeks ago and you made me dinner, which you were also eating for breakfast today, which was...
Imagine that.
Yeah. So why don't you tell folks about what this dinner was or your breakfast?
Yeah, so I remain fascinated by animal-based diets, carnivore diets, nose to tail eating. We'll get into all that in this podcast. The second edition of my book is coming out August the 4th. This podcast will probably be released sometime around then. So please check that out, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Over the 2 years I've been doing a carnivore diet, it's morphed. It's kind of gone up and down and around. And it's always been nose to tail. I've always eaten organs, but right now the iteration looks a little different than it did 8 months ago. And we can get into some of the nuances here, but what I made you for dinner was stew meat. So grass-fed, grass-finished stew meat from Belcampo. And I like that because it's rich in collagen. It's kind of that, it has some connective tissue in it. And I cook it, and it's affordable. So a lot of people, when they think about animal-based diets, they say it's too expensive. I can't eat ribeyes 3 times a day, 7 days a week. They say, oh, that guy Paul, he just eats this crazy expensive diet. And it's not. I mean, the stew meat I get is $10 a pound of Belcampo. Or $10 a pound.
It's like the highest quality stuff you can
exactly
get.
That's the highest quality. Or $10 a pound at White Oak Pastures or any of these other farms, you can get stew meat, which is fantastic. And I cooked it for you in bone broth that I had made. So I got an Instant Pot. It's totally simple. I take spring water. I put in patellar bones, which are amazing because they're trabecular end bones. They're like the joint bones of an animal, and they're covered in tendons. And I put in some tendons in the bone broth, and I make my own bone broth. It takes a couple hours in the Instant Pot. And then I cooked the stew meat for you in the bone broth. So I think these are some of the questions that we have around cooking of food. There are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines made when we cook anything, whether it's plant matter or meat or animal foods. And so, a lot of times the criticisms of a meat-based or an animal-based diet are, oh, you're going to get a lot of these Maillard products, these advanced glycation end products, or these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines. But, for the last few months, I've been doing this experiment. Well, what if I boil things? What if I blanch food? What if I cook meat?
Yeah. It's almost not even cooked. It was like a quick...
Yes, it's blanched.
Yeah.
It's mostly raw in the middle. And I would just call it very, very, very rare. But I really like it. You could cook it longer if you wanted it to be more cooked. It's just how I'm doing it now. It's easy. There's none of these products. There's no polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There's no heterocyclic amines. And it's cooked in bone broth. And then I served you the bone broth, the meat, some Redmond real salt. I think I gave you a couple of egg yolks from Shirttail Creek Farms, which are the most orange egg yolks I've ever seen. And I probably gave you some organ meats, like liver.
That was it. Yep.
Yeah. And that's most of what I eat. We can talk about the addition of honey as well.
Yeah, I was over here this morning, and then it was the same exact thing. So it was like, must be just almost every meal. So we were chatting before as well about why carnivore diet works so well, and sort of like what each of us are thinking regarding nutrition and life in general. And sort of came up that my point was that I think that carnivore diet works so well for people who can do it. Yes, nutrition, like there's a lot of things that go there, but if you can eat sort of how you're doing it and not have it be this thing with like spices and herbs and constantly using nutrition as a way to distract yourself or please yourself or any other mean that like, but people just use nutrition as such a different thing than actually getting nutrition. They use food as a way to distract themselves and pleasure themselves. And when you do this and you restrict yourself, that probably has a vast amount of additional life.
We're outside.
A vast amount of additional sort of carry-on effects that for your mental health helps you with all these other things that it takes to actually be healthy.
Discipline is freedom, right? That's Jocko's words, not mine. But I think it's true. When people think about this, and I wrote about this at the end of the Carnivore Code, the last 2 chapters are how to do a carnivore diet. Some of the struggles that I hear people thinking about when I tell them how I eat an animal-based diet are, I could never eat only meat, or that's boring. And these concerns, these fears are directly coming from a place, usually, of most of us, myself included in the past, using food as entertainment. If we use food as entertainment, it's going to prevent us from making a lot of the changes we may need to make in our diets that will lead to better health. Now, that could be changes toward elimination of certain plants that are triggering our immune system. That could be elimination of processed sugars or processed vegetable oils. That could be elimination of all kinds of things in our diet. Coffee, if it's, causing us to have a negative effect. I hear this all the time in people I'm talking to, but I like that. But I like that food. I don't want to take it out of my diet. And it's really an interesting challenge. It's a mindset challenge. And in the beginning of the book, I offer something called the quality of life equation. My goal is not to convince everyone on the planet to never eat plants again. My goal is just to offer some tool that those who are suffering might use to feel better. And if it's a unique tool that other people haven't talked about, great. Or if it's a tool that other people have talked about and I can offer it in a way that's a little more clear or a little more accessible for people, that's amazing. But you get to define your quality of life. I'm not going to tell you what your quality of life is. If your highest quality of life is drinking beer and coffee and eating cake and foods with processed vegetable oils or foods with gluten that hurt your gut or cause you GI symptoms but give you pleasure, I'm not the person who's going to tell you what your highest quality of life is.
Right. Yeah, I think a big distinction as well is, and I say the same thing about fasting, you should be able to go without food. You don't have to. And the same thing with these concepts. You don't need to divorce food from pleasure or entertainment or social settings or enjoyment or whatever. It doesn't have to be such a terrible experience, but you should be able to go without that. But people are dependent on this and cannot go without their favorite drink or their favorite food or whatever. And that dependency, I think, creates a lot of weird things down the chain.
And it overflows into other areas of our life. What other things are we doing for entertainment, for distraction, for pleasure that are preventing us from growing as humans? And so the food is a microcosm of other areas of your life. How you do something is how you do everything. And like you said, animal foods are not unpleasant. I'm not eating sticks and rocks, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty bland when I had it, but it's totally like, I had no problem with that. There's people who would have severe problems with that and be like, oh, gross, I can't eat this. And there's so many times when I try to influence people to eat and I get way less restrictive than you, just eating real foods that spoil. They go, oh, well, I can't give up X, Y, or Z thing. And I think humans should, we had all our human history, except the last 100 years, we were able to choose every single meal what we were going to eat from anything that was available in the world. Because it's a very modern thing.
Yeah.
And now people are becoming so dependent on it just like they are on their phones for entertainment
and Netflix.
Yeah. And like you should be able to go without these things. I don't think you need to deprive yourself all the time. If you want to have this stuff, great. But the fact that most people cannot have a bland diet or one bland meal is really problematic.
I don't think of a carnivore diet as restrictive. I think of it as intentional. You are choosing the foods. In my case, you are choosing the foods. I am choosing the foods that I believe to be the most health promoting for me. I don't see it as bland at all. Like I use salt. It has a lot of flavor. I'm able to sense the subtle flavors of the meat. I'm able to taste the meat from Belcampo or White Oak, which I think is delicious, with some Redmond real salt. I don't think of it as bland. It's all relative, right?
Yeah. Relative to how, I guess, how 99% of the rest of people eat.
Exactly. Relative to the overstimulation of processed food or extremely complex flavors. And again, it's not to say those are bad. It's just to say, what is the goal? And in my case, the goal is to nourish my mind, my heart, my body as much as I can. And this is, I think, the best way to do it. I don't feel deprived or restricted at any single meal. I basically eat the same meal twice a day, every day. And I enjoy it. I look forward to every single one, every single time. It never gets old for me. And I do think that there is some sustainability in terms of food fatigue for some people. But for me, I think it also has to do with the fact that I'm eating organ meat and I'm eating bone broth. I'm not just eating steak. We've talked about this previously on other podcasts. I'm not just favoring the muscle meat. I'm eating the organs. So there are all sorts of flavors. Liver tastes different. And if I gave liver to most people in the population, they would say, that's gross, quote unquote. Well, there are indigenous tribes in Africa that absolutely savor that and think it's the most delicious thing ever. So what's the difference? It's our conditioning and what we're used to. But I love what you said earlier. I see this in myself, and I fear that as a culture, we are headed in this direction. We're already there. We're just addicted to dopamine. And that's a cliche statement, but we are over dopaminized.
Right. And I think that it happens over such a long period of time that you don't even realize what's happening. And I should have a conversation with my friend Nat this morning about how he's been doing in quarantine. We went for a walk. He said that it's been great for him to establish, like, him and his wife went out to a restaurant that they haven't gone to in months the other day, and as well got like, okay, let's treat ourselves to some pizza. And they're like, this wasn't even, like, normally we wouldn't have known, but now we have this perspective where they go, oh, this basically isn't food anymore. And then it takes so long to get to that point for a lot of people. And I think that it does feel like you're depriving yourself because you have no other context about how to live your life. And once you're born and given these weird fake foods forever, you know nothing else. And there needs to be a reset point. And I think the more extreme you go, like the faster that reset happens. So I think going to a no spices carnivore diet can make it really challenging for people to do that. But I think it happens way faster. You can start normalizing your taste buds. And you look at, a piece of cake like a rock on the floor. Like
not even food.
It's not even food. It's not something you would put in your body. And that concept sounds really weird for people. And I think people who transition over a long period of time, like I had this thing where I would be like, I know I should be eating well. I'd maybe do like a 30-day thing. And then I would go to like an event or like a wedding or something like that, eat like, oh, okay, like I'll eat this now because I was depriving myself of it. And then there's sort of like this blended time where you're not necessarily fully changed in your perspectives, like what food is. But then over a certain period of time, you just have a new understanding of like what you're actually doing, why you're doing it, and more intentional, like you said. And that happens just way faster, I think, when you do more restrictive diets.
And again, you're using the word restrictive again, but I'll reframe it. Comparatively and intentional. And the other piece of that for me is it's all relative, right? It looks restrictive relative to what we eat today. I talk about this in my book. It's something we've talked about on previous podcasts. What did our ancestors eat? It's very much like our ancestors eat. Yeah. And that's a reason that I'm fascinated by these animal-based diets. Evolutionarily, you and I have been sharing our appreciation of Chris Ryan's book, Civilized to Death, over the last few days, weeks. And evolutionarily, an animal-based diet, I believe strongly, is much more consistent with what we were doing, with our history, with what's written in our genes, than anything like what we're doing today in any way, shape, or form. So I see it more as a return. And Chris Ryan's point in Civilized to Death is, hey, so much of what we're doing today is different than what we have evolved to do socially, structurally, the way we're raising our kids, the way we're living in cities. And he talks a little bit about diet in there, but I would argue that in terms of diet, we are also civilized to death.
Oh, absolutely.
And the way that we're eating today, our reference point is so skewed that it needs a reset. And that's where an animal-based diet can be very helpful. And like I said earlier in the podcast, for some people who have autoimmunity or GI issues that are recalcitrant, returning to this, what I believe is a pretty good recreation of an ancestral diet is incredibly healing. Not everyone needs to go this far toward that, but moving on that spectrum, I think, is what we're both about. Moving back toward that evolutionarily consistent way of eating, I think it brings so much health back to us, and we've lost it as a people.
Right. And we talked about this in the previous podcast too, around my thought is that animals are essentially unchanged a little bit. More you eat like wild meat, things like that. You go out hunt elk, something, great, cows, chickens, things like that. Animals are closer to what we were able to eat 10,000 years ago, 2 million years ago, et cetera. Whereas plants have been so changed. And it's, even if you choose plants at a grocery store right now, they're going to be very, very, very different from what an ancestral population would eat. We were talking about this recently about potato varieties in Peru. And I was saying like, oh, it's like 2,000. Turns out I actually looked into those 4,000 different varieties that they eat. So you're looking at like, as you say in the book a lot around the compounds in the plants that can be toxic for humans, different varieties have different representation of these toxins. And so if you're spreading this out across 4,000 different varieties of one plant versus now we have like 3 if we go to a grocery store, and those 3 have been selected over the last couple hundred years to be the exact same and like taste the best and probably have a really high amount of certain of these compounds. Eating plants can be really challenging now. People don't even realize that. Even if they eat a real foods diet, it can trigger a lot of these autoimmune things because if they eat the same Jacinto kale every single day from some commercial farm that isn't even getting the nutrition from the soil, it's being sprayed with stuff for 25 years and then wondering why something goes wrong in their body, it can happen for sure.
Yeah, not only did our ancestors appear to eat mostly animals and plants, I think, as a survival food, what you're saying is totally correct, that the plants they did eat were from many different varieties. I recently did a podcast with Lauren Cordain, the guy that wrote the Paleo Diet in the 90s, and his research group, and they had spoken to Douglas London, who was an anthropologist at Harvard. And he went to the Amazon, apparently worked with this tribe called the Kawymeno, Kawaymeno, previously uncontacted in the Amazon. And they ate over 70 different varieties of fruit throughout the year. And interestingly, what I learned from Douglas London's work was that this indigenous tribe in the Amazon doesn't really eat vegetables. They don't eat roots or stems or leaves or seeds, which are generally what we think of as vegetables, the vegetable part of plants. But they did eat 70 different varieties of fruit, and they ate them at different times of the year. So they're, in every way, shape, and form, our ancestors' consumption of plants was much more vast than ours. And so you'll hear people like Mark Hyman say, our ancestors ate all these different types of plants, therefore you should eat the rainbow at the grocery store, which is just, it doesn't make any sense because you cannot eat the rainbow at the grocery store because it's all the same species. There are 4 species in the grocery store. There's brassica, maybe 12 max at a fancy grocery store. It's all different types of bell peppers. It's all the same species. It's all hybrids. And like you said, if you're eating the same species, you're getting an abundance of these plant molecules, which humans may have some differential ability between humans to detoxify, but ultimately you will overwhelm your detoxification systems, both the phase 1 or the phase 2. So that CYP 450 system and the phase 2 system, the glucuronidation system, et cetera. And it's not a question of if plants have toxins. It's a question of how well any individual can detoxify these compounds. And that is probably one of the reasons our liver evolved these enzymatic systems in our body. So occasionally you could imagine a situation, and this is what I think happened, that we were eating the majority of our food as animals. And in the book, I talk about evidence for that, looking at stable isotopes. In the spring and the fall, when fruits were in season, we probably ate fruit, different varieties at different times of the year, not something you're going to overconsume. And then if we were really in trouble, we might have done detoxification methods for, quote, vegetables like fermentation to make them less toxic. We know that fermentation of brassica eliminates the glucosinolates.
Soaking, sprouting,
things
like that as
things
well.
like this can help make them more palatable.
Which no one does now.
No one does anymore, right? We certainly didn't have pressure cookers 50,000 years ago or 2 million years ago, but soaking and sprouting, I think it's reasonable to hypothesize like, hey, this was our backup plan. You know, if you absolutely could not get food from animals, you have to survive. Humans are resourceful. Here's your survival food. Make it the least toxic it is as possible. But you're going to, even having that as part of the equation, you're going to eat different varieties. You're going to eat them occasionally. And it's much less likely you're going to overwhelm the body's defense detoxification mechanisms. Whereas today, we overindulge. People eat spinach every day or 3 times a week, or kale 5 times a week. I had an experience when I was a raw vegan 15 years ago.
Can't even imagine that.
I know. You can't. Well, I didn't look anything like this. I was 30 pounds of muscle lighter. And I was on a wheatgrass kick because everybody knows wheatgrass is the best thing on the planet. So I had a wheatgrass grinder in my house. My buddy made me shelves. I was growing wheatgrass on these shelves, and I would grind my own wheatgrass every day. And even believing through and through as a raw vegan that wheatgrass was God's gift to the earth and humans. One day I came home, probably 25 days into wheatgrass every day, and I could not get it down. And it was nauseating. There was a very clear reaction from my body. There are too many alkaloids in this wheatgrass. Stop eating it, you moron.
Martha, my fiance Martha, had the same situation with beets when she was eating the same salad every day for a while when she lived in New York, because it's super easy. She tells a story all the time about how she ate the same salad, and then one day she was like, no more fucking beets. I am done with beets. Like, she can't eat them. Like, anytime they come up now, she's like, no way.
I can't even walk past the.
I can't even see it.
I can't even walk past anywhere that's juicing wheatgrass now. I just can't. I'll like vomit in my mouth a little bit.
Right.
My body's had this visceral reaction. If you look at the way that herbivores eat plants, they eat a little bit of this plant, a little bit of that plant, a little bit of that plant. They don't just go and eat one plant all day.
Right.
They're eating 50 different types of plants in a given field, and there's good evidence from researchers who do this sort of animal welfare research that in the setting of animals in confinement or moved into spaces that they're not usually occupying, so artificial or sort of pressured living situations, if they overconsume certain types of plants, they have these mass die-offs. So when animals are pressured with their ecosystem, or they're grazing in a field that doesn't have enough variety, there's historical evidence of animals dying in the wilderness from not being able to consume enough different varieties of different plants.
Right. Which is, again, why I typically argue for people to eat locally from farmers markets. Like, that'll at least get you seasonality, variety, et cetera, when you're eating vegetables, instead of like eating these big box grocery stores, even like Whole Foods. Like, yes, they do some stuff locally, but they're sourcing locally from farms that can provide to giant grocery stores.
Exactly.
It's very, very different.
Monocrop.
Yeah.
Monocrop agriculture, as opposed to something that's probably more toward a biodynamic system. You've got to imagine the soil on a local farm is better than a huge monocrop. Right. Massive nightmare.
And also just the types of seeds that they're using, the type of plants they're growing, very, very, very different.
Yeah.
Whole Foods is incentivized to remove variability from the plants.
Like Starbucks.
Just like, Starbucks or McDonald's or whatever. So that way people can go to different stores and experience, when I buy kale in Minnesota in the middle of winter versus in Texas in the summer, it's going to taste the exact same. They want that experience.
It looks the same. Yeah. It tastes the same for everything.
Which is weird.
It's not natural.
Right. And a question about the tribe who ate the different types of fruit. Was there any data around spectrum or variety of animal foods? And if there was any seasonality there with animal foods?
I want to get him on my podcast. I don't know off the top of my head.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
I asked you this like a couple weeks ago, like, how do you feel about just eating just beef over and over and over again? Like, do you think there's any variability that we should be eating in animal products?
Good question. It's interesting. Maybe. I think that you certainly get variability when you're eating the organs, right? So you're eating the beef liver and the beef spleen and the beef pancreas, or using desiccated organs, which we can talk about because I've got a new exciting project happening there. But I do think that probably we would have eaten all sorts of different animals, although there's historical evidence of Native Americans eating a lot of buffalo.
Yeah.
And biochemically, I think it's, perhaps more safe to eat the same type of animal over and over and over, because we are not aware of the same sort of defense chemicals. Animals can run away from you. They can kick you. They can bite you. They can gore you. They're harder to kill than a plant. A plant's real easy to kill, but an animal's much harder to kill, and they don't have the same toxic chemicals that accumulate in humans. And I would happily argue or debate anyone who would say that they do, because there's plenty of good evidence that I talk about in my book debunking the notion that any of the compounds found in red meat, especially, are harmful for humans. Heme iron, saturated fat, these are not harmful for humans. There's great evidence for this.
You say that, so when we cook in certain ways, over direct heat, high heat, you can produce like some of these heterocyclic amines, things like this. So have you seen much around how much, for instance, like a tribe somewhere that's still doing this and living ancestrally cooks over fire in their rates of like the assumed, oh, this leads to cancer or whatever. Like, are there any associations here, or do they not cook like that? Is that sort of a misconception?
It's a great question. I think that I need to get Douglas London on my podcast and ask him how the Kaiwi Meno cook. I do think the Eskimo did a lot of boiling. I think that
hard to keep a fire in the Arctic.
Yeah. Or how do you do this kind of stuff? It would be interesting to see how our ancestors were cooking.
And I'm sure it's one of these things where this is one type of cellular stress. And if Americans have really shitty meat and they grill it and they overcook it and they burn it and they're eating that on top of a bunch of environmental toxins, things like that, pollution, et cetera, eating other crappy food, it's going to add up.
It can add up. And if you look at the physiology, this is what's so interesting to me. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heterocyclic amines, they occur in any food. They occur in coffee, and they all trigger the NRF2 system. So they trigger this antioxidant response element in the liver. And I do think that they probably are slightly harmful for humans, which is one of the reasons that when I have the ability to, which is nearly every day now, I will cook in water. I'll cook in the broth and say, okay, let's see how do I feel with this lower amount.
Have you noticed anything?
Not yet, but I'm going to repeat some labs just this week. I've been doing a whole blood work analysis recently, which we can talk about any of my recent blood panel if you want to, which is really fascinating because I just got my LDL back. But
your high cholesterol,
my high cholesterol
was like 8,000.
Essentially,
was it 400 something, 500 something?
So my total cholesterol was 643. My LDL was 533. And I went and got a CAC scan, a coronary artery calcium scan. It's 0, not surprising. So we can talk about why I think this.
How long have you been carnivore for?
2 years. And my LDL has been over 300 for over 2 years.
You're how old? 43.
With a father who had a heart attack at the age of 43.
Got it.
So I have a first degree relative with premature atherosclerosis, had an angioplasty, which means he had such severe atherosclerosis at the age of 43, my age, that he had to have a balloon in his artery to open his artery. And now at the age of 43, after eating a carnivore diet for 2 years with a cholesterol over 300 for 2 years, and now at 533, my coronary artery calcium score is 0, meaning I have no calcified plaque in my arteries anywhere.
Do you think that it would take longer than 2 years to create calcification?
So I asked my friend Tommy Wood this, and he cited one of his friends, I believe, I'll have to get the name for you. It's a cardiologist who does a lot of imaging. And in the world of cardiac imaging, the consensus or the feeling is no, it would not. We should ask more of our cardiology friends who do the imaging. But Tommy's actually going to do a study which is going to be 6 months or a year long with people on ketogenic diets and doing CTA, so CT coronary angiograms on them at the beginning and the end. And I think it's Chris Budwig is the cardiologist he's working with. He might be a radiologist, like a cardiac radiologist. But the information that I got from Tommy through this radiologist was, oh no, if your cholesterol is that high, you will see plaque develop in a year for sure. And I have 2 years into it now. So that's going to be the criticism. Oh, you wouldn't get plaque. But I don't have any plaque. Like I don't have any calcified plaque in my arteries.
Yeah.
And my LDL is 533. Clearly the LDL hypothesis, the lipid hypothesis is flawed. And I talk about, there's a whole chapter in my book about that as well. And we can go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if you add tons of inflammation and a lot of other different like degradation of pathways, then yes, that's probably a bad thing. But if you're boiling your stew meat in bone broth, like you are reducing every part of inflammation dietarily that I could ever imagine.
Insulin resistance, I think, is the main driver. And so this is not to say that we do not see elevated LDL in people with metabolic dyslipidemia or diabetes. But is it the elevated LDL that's really driving the atherosclerosis, or is the LDL getting pulled into a pathogenic process that was started by something else? And I think it's the latter, because we see a real discordance in clinical outcomes between people who have elevated, quote, LDLs on ketogenic carnivore diets, higher saturated fat diets, and those who achieve higher LDL through metabolic dyslipidemia or diabetes, right? These are very different states, and they are conflated repeatedly within medicine, because in mainstream medicine, I was never taught about ketogenic physiology or animal-based diets physiology in medical school. We don't know. All we are taught in medicine is LDL bad.
Right.
LDL, eliminate, statin. That's all we're taught. And there's a lot of nuance here. And cases like mine and many others, since getting this LDL of 533, and we can dive into why I think it's that level and why I don't think that's bad. I talk about all that in the book as well. I've talked to a number of friends, a number of physicians here in town who have similarly elevated LDLs, not as high as mine, but high LDLs. And I'm friends with one physician here in town who said his LDL has been above 250 for 10 years and his CAC score remains a 0. He's also very metabolically healthy and insulin sensitive.
How old is he?
He is, I want to say he's 48 or 49.
Yeah, because I know, like, obviously with your family history, sort of irrelevant on age, but I know that with the like, I got one just because I was curious a year or two ago, because my cholesterol has also been super high since I've been on keto, like, I don't know, 8 years ago. Carnivore stuff as well, not as high as yours, like 250-ish. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna check, and it was also 0. But I know that age, like, you just don't, like, it's sort of an irrelevant test before a certain age.
But it's not because, so we can talk about familial hypercholesterolemia, which is very different, right? So there are over 2,000 variants of familial hypercholesterolemia, but the main 4 variants are around the LDL receptor and LDL sort of flux metabolism in the liver and on macrophages and on these cells of the immune system. There are polymorphisms in the LDL receptor, polymorphisms in ApoB, polymorphisms, which is a protein on the surface of the LDL molecule. There are polymorphisms in PCSK9, which is a protein that recycles the LDL receptor. And these can lead to familial hypercholesterolemia. Kids with FH and polymorphisms in the LDL receptor metabolism pathway develop atherosclerosis in the first decade of life. So age is not a factor all in and of itself, right? But what's interesting is that not everyone with FH develops atherosclerosis this rapidly, or even at a rate that's different than the general population. It all has to do with where the polymorphism is that causes the LDL to be high. So polymorphisms of the LDL receptor, ApoB or PCSK9, affect LDL flux and LDL uptake by the macrophage. Those LDL polymorphisms causing FH cause accelerated atherosclerosis. But other people who have familial hypercholesterolemia that don't have polymorphisms in the LDL sort of metabolism flux pathway, the LDL uptake pathway with the macrophages, develop atherosclerosis at the rate of the general population and at the age of the general population. So interestingly, my LDL is now higher than 99% of people on this planet with familial hypercholesterolemia. And so if you accept that LDL in and of itself is a driver of atherosclerosis, I should have atherosclerosis in the next 3 to 4 years without a doubt. So again, there's nuance there. Did all that make sense?
Yeah. So you're saying that if people when they're young have this genetic thing where they have even on a lab marker, high LDL, then you with high LDL should have it.
I should have it, right?
Yeah.
If we're arguing that LDL is the problem, then I should have it, right? Because kids can get this in the first decade easily of their life with an LDL that's lower than mine. I'm not arguing for that. I don't believe the lipid hypothesis holds up to scrutiny when you look at all of these things and other data. I think there's absolutely something else there. There's a spark that's lighting the fire in terms of atherosclerosis. I talk about all this in the Carnivore Code. But in general, there are many who would say you haven't been doing it long enough to see a problem. Right. And they'll probably keep saying that for the next 20 years. And then they won't have anything to say. And then they'll say it's anecdote. So it's like, it's still valuable. But I think that you can make arguments on both sides and say, hey, there are kids with FH who have an LDL of 250 who develop atherosclerosis at the age of 8 or 6.
Your hypothesis of why it's so high, is it sort of in conjunction with Dave Feldman's? How do you think about this?
So Dave Feldman has an idea, which is what he would call the energy model, that LDL is part of energy trafficking. And I'm not convinced about that just yet. I love Dave.
Right. So basically, if you eat more fat, you're using fat for a fuel, LDL is going to be a continue to shuttle that fuel around your body to all cells. So
exactly.
that way it'll be more.
Exactly. What's interesting, and we can talk about this because I think your audience will find it interesting, is that I have been eating a lot of carbohydrates recently and my LDL has gone up. So I think that we can also look at cholesterol synthesis pathways. So if people are familiar, I'm sure your audience is like super sharp and knows this, but there is this pathway called the mevalonate pathway, and I describe it in the book as well.
I don't think there's going to be a lot of people who
know about the mevalonate pathway. It's how cholesterol gets made. In the mevalonate pathway is HMG-CoA reductase, which is the enzyme that statins inhibit. But ketones and cholesterol share a common pathway, which is why I have a diagram of the mevalonate pathway in my book. And so some people hypothesize that when you are in ketosis, because they share a common pathway, the production of ketones may lead to the production of more cholesterol. That's an interesting and compelling hypothesis. And we do see LDL rise in fasting states. There's good evidence to show that if we stop eating, LDL rises. But you can also look at intermediates in that cholesterol synthesis pathway. Desmosterol is a good one, and it's pre-cholesterol. And my desmosterol is very high, suggesting that for some reason, my body is making a lot of the cholesterol steroid molecule. Now, it's important to mention that LDL is a lipoprotein particle. It's a single lipid monolayer, which is, has proteins in the monolayer. It's like a balloon full of cholesterol, which is a steroid molecule, and triglycerides, triacylglycerols. So ApoB is one of these apolipoproteins that is in the LDL molecule. But also in LDL is cholesterol, which is a steroid backbone. It looks very different than, quote, fat. It's not a triacylglycerol. It's not a triglyceride. So having said that, my body is making a lot of cholesterol. My desmosterol goes up. And I see this routinely in my clients. You can check desmosterol. So I think that the main reason that my cholesterol, my LDL is up is because my body is making more cholesterol. And then it's moving through the LDL to membranes of my body. It's moving to cell membranes. Now, people might think this is a bad thing, except when I mention that your testicles, my testicles, ovaries are some of the richest places for LDL delivery. And they have lots of LDL receptors because our body uses this cholesterol to make hormones.
So is the thought that like plant sterols downregulate desmosterol, or how?
Yes, that's another idea the idea is potentially that my hypothesis is that the ratio of saturated fat to polyunsaturated fat affects cholesterol synthesis in a certain way, because we know that polyunsaturated vegetable oils lower LDL, which is why they are the darlings of the cardiology industry. Maybe that's a Freudian slip. The cardiology within medicine, right? Cardiology specialty, cardiology industry. But we also know that in controlled interventional double-blind feeding trials like the Minnesota and Sydney Diet Heart, replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat leads to more death from coronary artery disease and more death overall and more death from cancer. We should definitely talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids. We also know that interventionally, replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat leads to more oxidized LDL and higher levels of Lp(a), which is lipoprotein (a). We don't fully understand what Lp(a) does, but it's generally accepted to be involved in the clearance of oxidized lipids from the body. So even though polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid, so omega-6 linoleic acid, lower LDL, they do seem to be associated pretty clearly with worse cardiac outcomes. So I'm eating a lot of saturated fat and almost no linoleic acid in my diet. So I think that is the main lever that I'm pulling here. So because I'm not lowering my LDL artificially with polyunsaturated fats, I suspect that because most of my diet is saturated and monounsaturated, which I believe are healthy fats, predominantly the saturated fats like stearic acid and palmitic acid that occur in animal foods naturally, there's something about that changes human biochemistry and jacks up cholesterol synthesis. And like I said, I really don't believe that's a bad thing. LDL carrying cholesterol has valuable roles in the immune system. I think we've talked about this on previous podcasts as well. I certainly talk about it in my book. LDL plays a role in the immune system. LDL delivers building blocks for cells and cell membranes. It's a critical molecule in the human body. And if you eliminate it from the human body, people get angrier, they get homicidal, they get suicidal,
right.
They get violent, and they have hormonal problems. There's a genetic condition called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, and it's a genetic polymorphism in the cholesterol synthesis pathway, in the mevalonate pathway. Most of these kids die in utero. The kids that do live suffer massive infections, mental delay, and pneumonia, sleep problems, some pretty major issues. How are they treated? They're given lots and lots of egg yolks. They're given massive amounts of egg yolks, and it helps them somewhat.
Right.
But it's very clear, if you look at the physiology, that LDL, and specifically the cholesterol carried within LDL, are very valuable to the human body. from an evolutionary level, I've always thought it fascinating. Why would our body increase something, specifically the LDL molecule, when we are starving that is killing us? It doesn't make any sense. So many of these ideas don't make any sense. It plays a role in the immune system. It's increased when you're starving. Like, these don't make any sense. It's just LDL itself initiating atherosclerosis. And you look at the interventional data, it doesn't make sense. You look at the epidemiology, it doesn't make sense. In the book, I took the Framingham data for LDL and coronary artery disease incidence. So this is epidemiology. And if you look at the overall graph of LDL level and coronary artery disease incidence, it's a straight line. There's a correlation. But if you fractionate that by insulin sensitivity, meaning if you look at the amount of HDL, if you take that one line, which kind of goes up to the right, and you fractionate it into 4 lines, 4 subgroups based on HDL, what you find is that the higher your HDL, the less correlation there is between your LDL level and coronary artery disease. So to me, that's a really striking statement that it's probably insulin resistance that is driving atherosclerosis, not LDL itself. If LDL itself were driving atherosclerosis, we should see the same relationship between LDL and coronary artery disease, regardless of HDL.
Another thing that was changed about your nutrition recently, which sort of ties into a lot of this stuff, is that there was no egg yolk on the cutting board.
Right.
And I said, what the hell, no egg yolks?
So,
and we had chatted a couple of weeks ago around, what's this guy's name at Fire in a Bottle?
Matt Black? No, not Matt. I'll think of it. I'm sorry, Jeff. I'm blanking on his name. I feel so bad.
Yeah. So we both looked up his work, and we were chatting about it a couple of weeks ago, involving, like, he's done some interesting experiments. He did this thing called the croissant diet. Yeah. And which was ridiculous. And we can chat about sort of what the thesis is here, but his thinking was just like polyunsaturated fatty acids are the things that are driving so many problems, and removing that, you can lose weight, you can be metabolically healthy, et cetera. And so you're doing an extreme experiment where you're removing pretty much every source of PUFA possible.
As much as possible.
Yeah, and there is some in egg yolks for sure. And this is also why I put this in a newsletter a couple of weeks ago, but American or sort of like industrialized, even if they're fed appropriate food, pigs and chickens are like, it's like mid 20% PUFAs with pigs, and I think like 30% with chickens, as they should be, like on small islands where they've been contained for the last couple thousand years. We're looking at like 2 to 3%. And this is why I continually tell Martha not to eat chicken. She won't listen to me. So I'll figure out a way to convince her at some point, but it's basically like eating vegetable oil.
It is. If you look at ancestral diets, Maasai, Tokelau, whoever, Ikung, Hadza, San, across the board, you see linoleic acid, which is an 18-carbon, omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, as 2 to 3% of total calories. Right. 2 to 3%. In 2020, it's 17 to 20% of total calories of Americans. It's 10x right now or more. It's really, really high.
This is one of the things too, you can graph. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into this, but you can graph it along with obesity and diabetes straight up into the right.
Oh yeah, it makes absolute sense. So your friend Jeff Nobbs, has done a great post on this. So this gentleman that we were talking about earlier, his name is Brad Marshall at Fire in a Bottle. And yeah, he and I have had a lot of conversations about that. I've been also very similarly concerned about polyunsaturated fatty acids. We can talk about the croissant diet, but if you look at just at a correlation, right? We can't make causative inference here. But if you look at correlation between obesity and diabetes and changes in the American diet in the last 50 years, the biggest correlation is vegetable oils. Carbohydrates, they've kind of gone down. Sugars are pretty flat. Animal foods have gone down. Consumption of chicken has gone up because everybody thinks chicken is healthy for whatever reason, because red meat has been vilified. And I'm not blaming it more on...
It's a saturated fat, and then you can remove the skin from the chicken and you're removing a lot of the fat.
Right, exactly, which is bad. But if you look at it, American vegetable oil consumption has increased massively in the last 100 years. The first vegetable oil was made in 1865, and the big one was 1911 with Crisco. Yeah. 1865 was cottonseed oil, then 1911 was Crisco, and since then, it's been on a rampage. In 1865, there were essentially no reported heart attacks in the medical literature of any significant, amount, like occasionally, but very, very rare. When animal fat was the majority of our diet, even lard from naturally raised animals that were not necessarily eating tons of corn and soy, there were no heart attacks. facts. And again, this is correlation. So we're generating a hypothesis, which we must then test and corroborate. But there is a really strong correlation between the increased consumption of omega-6 linoleic-rich vegetable oils and the consumption of corn and soy-fed chicken and pork in the last 50 to 100 years, and the massive increase in basically every single chronic disease. Earlier, you mentioned animals are basically the same as they are, aside from chicken and pork.
Yeah, and the reason why is the digestive system, so they can't filter that stuff out, so it gets incorporated. They're eating awful foods, that food gets incorporated into their tissues, whereas a ruminant, like a cow, for example, what is it, like 80, 85, 90% of what they eat turns into saturated, like small chain fatty acids, saturated fatty acids.
Cows have a different biochemistry.
Yeah.
And they can take, and I'm not advocating for this, for factory farming or corn and soy, but if a cow is fed corn and soy, their fat will only become enriched a small amount in linoleic acid.
Yeah, Rob and Diana did a really good job in Sacred Cow breaking this down. And like, I think that people are probably going to be pissed, saying like, I already had a couple of people message me saying, I thought it was like way healthier to eat grass-fed meat than grain-fed meat. And it turns out the metabolism of a cow sort of like is magic and helps not pass that same amount on as would a chicken or a pig. I mean, there's still a lot of things I think why you should be eating grass-fed meat. Like, I do not say like, doesn't matter, eat grain-fed, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, from ethical to environmental to nutritional, but it's not as vast as people think.
So I have a section in the book about this, and I talked to Rob and Diana in the podcast. I wouldn't, if someone does not have access to grass-fed, grass-finished meat, I would not use this as an excuse not to eat red meat.
Right.
I would not use this as an impediment. Having said that, neither of us believes nor supports factory farming or the feeding of cows corn and soy. And in the book, I mentioned that my main concern with grain, quote, feeding of cows is not what's in the meat nutritionally, it's what's in the meat in terms of toxins, glyphosate, atrazine, and other things like that. So that's my main concern with factory farming, which in my opinion is equally or also concerning. But nutritionally, you're absolutely right, as are Rob and Diana. Nutritionally,
when you're looking just like straight at the saturated.
If you look at the fatty acid profile, it's pretty similar. Now, is a grain-fed cow metabolically as healthy as a grass-fed cow? No, not really. They're not. That's why they get more intramuscular marbling, more intramuscular fat. That's why they put on more fat, is because they basically get insulin resistant. A grain-fed cow is fattier because it's more insulin resistant. It's more like a standard American diet. Again, I'm not supporting that, but I think grass feeding the cow is going to give you a much cleaner animal in terms of glyphosate, atrazine, all the other toxins that are going into it. And as we know, it's something to support. But if you can't get that, red meat is still the best thing to eat. Don't eat chicken. Don't eat pork, in my opinion. And definitely don't eat vegetable oils, which, just so everyone listening to this knows, we're talking about corn, canola, cottonseed, soybean, peanut, all these oils.
Yeah, potentially avocado. I mean, I put something in my
with soybean oil.
So I put in my newsletter that there was like I think 82% that were studied were either partially or 100% soybean oil.
82% of avocado oil.
How criminal is this?
It used to happen with olive oil,
right? But
there's no regulation now with avocado oil, and avocado oil is in vogue. Now, whenever I talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we can go as deep in this rabbit hole as you want, people always ask, what about olive? What about coconut? And my first response is, why not just use tallow? Number one, if you're cooking with oil, do you want to be cooking with oil? Do you really want to be putting oil in a pan and frying meat in oil?
This is exactly what people have. Like, I posted this on Instagram, that study, and people, maybe 50 people responded to me saying like, well, what do you cook with oil? And I say, I do not consume liquid oil.
Why do you consume liquid oil? Why do we need to do that? If you really want to, use tallow, like your ancestors
Even
were.
if you fry something, like, so Jeff Knobs has a restaurant in San Francisco. They use both tallow and they use palm oil to fry stuff in. So they're using high saturated fat oils, which actually last way longer in a fryer anyway. So like,
right.
That's the only thing where people go, well, I want liquid oil for a fryer. Well, you can just melt down, not like
tallow.
Yeah, tallow, which I hear fries their chicken on Sunday nights in tallow. Same thing.
You got to wonder, like, why are you eating fried chicken? But again, it's like, it's your quality of life, not mine. Like, if you want to do that, do tallow, way better. But that goes back to why I'm doing it in my house with just bone broth, because I'm trying to see how it feels to do as little of that as possible. And Certainly our ancestors probably did that. I think it's a great question. I should ask as many anthropologists as I know, like, how do our ancestors cook? I don't think they had pots and pans. Like, how do you cook in water? But I think it's quite possible.
So I've been, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I've been eating cacao butter in the morning. It's just like I haven't gotten any suet, and I've already had a ton of it, really high in stearic acid.
Right.
And I've noticed that the amount I eat in a day is drastically less if I have 15 to 20 grams of cacao butter in the morning.
Let's talk about it. It's so cool.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know of any pathways or anything that's working with that as far as like a satiation effect.
Absolutely.
But it will be like yesterday is the case. I had like 20 grams in the morning and like 15 grams of collagen, straight collagen peptides. And it was 7 o'clock and I was like, shit, I didn't eat today. And I had worked out, I had been outside. Like it wasn't like I was just sitting in front of my computer and just distracted the whole time. It's wild.
Yeah. So the flip side of polyunsaturated fatty acids are saturated fatty acids. And the one saturated fatty acid that we're talking about now is stearic acid, which is an 18-carbon saturated fatty acid. The difference between a saturated fatty acid and a polyunsaturated fatty acid is the number of double bonds. So a saturated fat has no double bonds, meaning all of the carbons are saturated with hydrogen. It's all single bonds between the carbons and it's saturated with hydrogen. An unsaturated fatty acid is not, the carbons are not saturated with hydrogen, but there are double bonds in that molecule. The double bonds change the way the molecule is metabolized in the mitochondria during beta oxidation, and we can talk about that. And they affect sort of the production of what are called oxalams, oxidative metabolites of oxidative linoleic acid metabolites, which are things like 4-HNE, 9 and 13-HODE, which are negative products of oxidation of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. Because
what are these?
These are essentially harmful byproducts of excess polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Are they just like straight carbon chains, or like what are?
They are. They're like lipid peroxides in a way. Yeah, they're sort of cyclic lipid, lipid sort of. Maybe some of them may be cyclized, but they're lipid products of peroxidation and oxidation of these linoleic acid molecules. So what's interesting is the flip side of that is stearic acid, which is an 18-carbon saturated fatty acid. And your question is exactly what Brad is fascinated by and the point of the croissant diet. So in the croissant diet, I'm going to have Brad on my podcast. I think he'd be a great guest for you too. He ate a very high stearic acid diet. Now, stearic acid is high in cacao butter. It's about 30% in that, right?
Yeah, 30, 35.
And that it's about the same amount in suet. So this is another fascinating thing about kidney fat on animals is suet is also very high in stearic acid.
And they had the same mouthfeel. You gave me some when I was here and it chewed like sort of like bubble gum, and the same thing that happens with the cacao butter too. Like if you get real good stuff, it's very, like not ultra refined.
Very waxy.
Yeah. So you could chew on it for minutes at a time.
Yeah. You often need to put it in bone broth or eat it with something that's warm to get it down. But the stearic acid, so I think I sent you the study. This is a mouse study, but it's looking at, actually, no, it's a human study. This is an amazing study. So they took humans and they put them on a low stearic acid vegan diet for 2 days. And they could see the levels of 18-carbon stearic acid in their blood go down. And what they also saw was that acylcarnitines went up. Acylcarnitines are a measure of fat burning. They're fatty acid oxidation. So your mitochondria stop burning fat when you don't have stearic acid. And they actually imaged the mitochondria in these humans. And they could see that when they were stearic acid deprived on a low stearic acid vegan diet for 2 days, their mitochondria were fragmented. They were sort of strung out into chains and individual mitochondria. And then they gave them 26 grams of stearic acid, which is a good amount of stearic acid. You'd have to eat a lot of suet. You'd have to eat about 75 to 100 grams of suet or cacao butter to get that much stearic acid. But what they immediately saw was the mitochondria turned on. They started to coalesce. You can see this in the paper. The mitochondria actually fuse and they start burning fat. They turn the mitochondria on and you see acylcarnitines drop, which is an indicator of fatty acid metabolism turning on. So what happened is you deprive someone of stearic acid, the mitochondria stop doing beta oxidation. They stop burning fat and they get strung out. They get individual, they get kind of like scattered. You give them this one molecule, stearic acid, and they fuse and they turn on. They start burning fatty acid. It's fascinating. This is in humans. And stearic acid occurs in animal meat.
What's like the typical animal fat, not suet, was it like 12, 15%, something like that?
15% in like regular animal fat. Now, again, we're talking about ruminant animal fat here, and it depends what the animal's fed. I think grass-fed animals could be up to 16 or 18%.
Interesting.
Yeah. Suet, again, is more, and the cacao butter is more at 30%. But it's so fascinating because in that paper, they try palmitic acid and they try a 20-carbon fat, and they don't do the same thing.
Something to do with that C18.
It's a lipokine molecule. It is a signaling molecule in the human body. And we know this. We know that insulin resistance in the human body can be driven by free fatty acids in the blood. And we don't have to go down this rabbit hole today, but there seems to be a ratio between palmitoleic acid, which is I believe, a 16-carbon omega-7 monounsaturated fat, and palmitic acid, which is a 16-carbon saturated fat in the blood. And that is kind of the peripheral, that is a signal of the central adipocytes in the visceral adipose tissue to the periphery. And it is really centrally involved in the pathology of insulin resistance. And the reason I mention that is because fatty acids are signaling molecules, which is what's so interesting. And generally speaking, the fats we eat don't really change the fats in our bloodstream, but there's something special about stearic acid, that when you eat stearic acid, levels of stearic acid in your blood change. If you eat saturated fat, levels of palmitic acid in your blood do not change. But levels of stearic acid in your blood are very responsive to consumption of stearic acid in your diet. And I think this is just an evolutionary signal that you have a bounty of an animal, like a ruminant animal. And it's a signal. And we know this, which is what's so crazy, because forever and ever, people used to say, well, not forever and ever, but there is this sort of esoteric argument that, oh, if you have more saturated fat in your blood, specifically more palmitic acid in your blood, you have more insulin resistance. And at a molecular level, that's true. But the amount of saturated fat that you eat doesn't affect the amount of palmitic acid in your blood.
Same with like cholesterol, for example.
Exactly. So yes, in people who are systemically insulin resistant, there is a higher amount of palmitic acid in the blood. It's not a bad thing. It's part of the signaling that happens, and we can talk about why that is true. But stearic acid, this 18-carbon saturated fatty acid, is a signaling molecule from our diet, and it's really cool. Like, you can eat stearic acid, and this paper shows your mitochondria will start burning fat. And I think that in the brain, the same thing happens, that there's probably receptors in the hypothalamus, whether it's the ventromedial hypothalamus or wherever, the VMH or wherever, is sensing, because different parts of the hypothalamus sense hunger or are going to signal hunger or satiety. But I think that in the brain, we know there are neurons with mitochondria and there is signaling. And so something about stearic acid, I think, in the brain is signaling satiety. If you are getting suet, your brain is like, we're good. We're good, because suet is like this very valuable kidney fat food that's only going to be found when you have a kill. When you gratefully harvest a deer or a buffalo, you're going to eat that. You're going to eat all the fat on that animal. And when you eat that suet, or even the animal fat, which has a good amount of stearic acid, your body's going to get that satiety signal. And so what Brad is looking at in the croissant diet was hacking that mechanism by making croissants, which have carbohydrates, with high stearic acid butter. And he found, and I'm going to have him on my podcast, he's going to do more experiments, was that he experienced the same thing. Even by eating croissants with high stearic acid, which isn't the way that I would do it. Right. He was doing it just as a delivery mechanism, and he's a chef, so he thought, well, maybe I could make a croissant.
And because it's ridiculous.
What's that? Yeah.
So if he's like, okay, if I can do this, then point is proved.
It gets the point across, and I think it got some recognition, which was his point. Right? If you can eat a croissant that's high in stearic acid and lose weight and have satiety, there's something going on. But the take home is that molecule found in suet and cacao butter is a signaling satiety signal for human, is a signaling satiety.
Got it. So the thought is that I've been eating this, then my body has a signaling mechanism. Just switch to fat. You're good.
You're good.
We got this. It's fine.
Yeah. And if we looked at your mitochondria, they would be fusing and turning on. Your acylcarnitines would be dropping. You would be burning fat. You'd be doing beta oxidation in your fat with that stearic acid. Yeah. And so I think it's so fascinating. And it's one of the reasons. So I kind of hinted at this earlier with the organ meats, but one of the supplements that we're going to be developing at Heart and Soil, which is the supplement company that I'm launching in early August, we're doing these desiccated organ supplements. We're going to have bone marrow and liver and beef organs. And we're going to have a supplement in the future, which is called Firestarter, which is basically a high stearic acid fat that people can just eat. And it's the same. That's the reason we want to do that. Like, how do we get this into people as much as possible?
Yeah, I got a big bag of stearic acid the other day.
Yeah.
And it's like, I saw yours at the counter too. It's like, it's inedible. You can't really do anything with it.
You can't.
But it's such like, why not just take capsules of it? Like, you easily capsulize this stuff.
You could encapsulate. The question is the absorption. So I was talking to Brad about this. He feels like the absorption of pure stearic acid is pretty low, but you could encapsulate it. It's about 12%. I think you're going to absorb more stearic acid if you mix it with other fats.
Got it. Interesting.
So he was making the high stearic acid butter. He would take butter and then melt the stearic acid into it. But that is something that we could do, is make capsules with high stearic acid butter, or the capsules that we are making at Heart and Soil are called Fire Starter. They're just suet. They're the kidney fat rendered into a liquid that we encapsulate into a capsule.
Interesting.
So it's like a 33% stearic acid capsule of fat. And, it has other benefits of these healthy saturated fats.
I wonder if like combining with MCT would be like ultimate fire starter.
Yeah, right? That would be amazing if you had stearic acid and MCT in the same capsule.
How do you feel about things like MCT oil? Being that it's like an isolated fatty acid chain that's what are your thought processes?
It's another molecular signal. So what's interesting about MCT is it doesn't get burned in the mitochondria. It gets burned in peroxisomes. And so it's valuable, and it occurs in nature. And I think overconsumption is going to lead to imbalances. And we know that overconsumption of MCTs can lead to diarrhea and problems because it's not fully absorbed.
Right.
But I think it's valuable for humans. Absolutely. And I think that having ketones in your bloodstream is normal and natural, and is something that our ancestors had frequently. So I think MCTs are great. I think exclusive consumption of MCTs at the exclusion of other nutrient-rich foods is taking it too far.
Totally.
And a lot of MCT oils, I know yours isn't this way, are hexane extracted and are not, are going to have potentially organic chemicals in there. So you'd want to get a good one.
Yeah.
But I think with all this, the goal is not to, I've never really been interested in biohacking as much like, how does this inform us about the way our ancestors ate?
Yeah.
Our ancestors certainly got medium chain triglycerides, and a lot of fats that we eat are broken down into medium chain triglycerides. So fats that are too long are also broken down in the peroxisomes because they get broken down into, MCT length chains. So we make our own MCTs too out of like super long chain fats.
Right. How am I killing myself with the cacao butter? I know you have something up your sleeve for me.
I'd have to see it. It's probably pretty benign since it's purified.
Yeah.
The concern that I would have would just be any of the other chemicals in the cacao that are like polyphenolic, that are xenoestrogenic or affecting other biochemical pathways in your body. So I'm not sure how much remains in the oil. In the polyphenols probably are lipid soluble. So are you getting cacao alkaloids? Maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Curious. So another change is the several jars of honey
that are on my counter.
Yeah. So I tried this. We talked about it before when I was Carnivore last year as well. And I had a CGM on through levels.
Yeah, mine was through NutriSense. And, dueling CGMs.
And I would be shot up like two teaspoons. I would go like above 200.
That's crazy.
So it doesn't work for me, but you've been using honey and interesting carbohydrates. So curious as far as why you did that and what you noticed.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, so after a year and a half on a zero carbohydrate carnivore diet, I got increasingly curious about cycling in carbohydrates for a variety of reasons. Like many of your listeners who are interested in ketogenic diets may know, if humans don't have some, I don't want to say insulin signaling, because you're going to get some insulin signal with protein, even if you're eating it with fat. Fat essentially doesn't have much insulin signal at all, but protein has an insulin signal. But if you eat carbohydrates, you're going to get a bigger insulin signal. We know that. This is often vilified, and I don't think it's necessarily pathologic. But in the setting of insulin resistance, I do think excess carbohydrates can fan the flames. And I do believe that low carbohydrate diets are very valuable for humans, and we can talk about why. And I do believe that humans would have had ketones in their blood very frequently. And after a year and a half with zero carbohydrates, other than the glycogen that was found in the liver that I was eating and the small amount of glycogen that may have been in the muscle meat that I was eating, I just got a lot of muscle cramps. And I really came to realize that without some insulin signaling.
And you were pumping electrolytes too and sodium,
I was pumping electrolytes, pumping sodium, pumping magnesium. I one time took so much potassium, my mouth got numb.
Don't try this at home.
That's what happens before you die. Don't do that. You should not be megadosing oral potassium. It's dangerous, people. So I thought, this is not the answer. This is not the answer. And it's not ancestrally consistent. And it just sort of made sense. The little light bulb came on in my head, and I thought, you know what? I'm pretty sure every spring when fruit showed up, our ancestors would have eaten fruit. We would have had carbohydrates in a cyclic fashion. We would have eaten honey when we could get our hands on it. And so I started incorporating carbohydrates back in my diet gradually. I think I started with honey. I did a white rice experiment. I didn't really like the way that made me feel, and I just felt puffy subjectively. I felt like maybe it was sort of more.
Did any of your eczema or anything come back?
It did. My eczema came back when I added squash back, and I did not like the way I felt with fiber. So I have been essentially fiber-free in my diet for the last 2 years. And whenever I had large amounts of fiber, my gut did not like it. And it's probably just because my gut has adjusted to being zero fiber now. Perhaps if I kept eating lots of fiber, my gut would adjust, but I just don't like fiber in my diet. And I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about fiber in general. I'm not convinced that fiber is totally benign for humans in and of itself. I talk about that in the Carnivore Code as well. But I did a lot of carbohydrate experiments. And for part of that time, a month, I wore a CGM from the great folks at NutriSense, which have this app, which is really easy to read. And
yeah, the levels one's way clearer. And they're updating every day pretty much. And I can get a link to a sign up on that one.
Or if you go to my site, you can get a link to sign up at NutriSense. And
they're both the same meter. Go test your blood sugar, either one of them.
Do a CGM, choose a company. But the people at NutriSense are nicer. So I did a whole podcast on NutriSense, on my CGM from NutriSense, and you can see my blood sugar with a variety of carbohydrates. Most of it was honey, because at that point I had figured out that honey was what felt the best for me. And I could do 60, 70 grams of carbohydrates and my blood sugar would go to 120 or 130. It would never go to 200. I had a very different blood sugar response to honey than you did. And then it would come back down immediately. And then within an hour, it was back down to a baseline of 70 or 80. So my glycemic variability was very low. Eating honey for months and months and months did not make me insulin resistant. My baseline remained low. My postprandial insulin spikes remained very, very thin and very sharp, which is how you want your body to be. You want the glucose disposal to be robust and very quick. You don't want that big postprandial arcing spike that has a lot of area under the curve, which is technically what we would call the glycemic index of a food.
So I haven't published this yet, because I don't know what I want to do with it. I want to sort of make a bigger thing of it, but I had Oatly. I had 1 cup of Oatly, whatever's in like a large latte, and it spiked my blood sugar by like 80 to 100 points for like 3 hours.
That's insane. That's what you don't want.
People think this is a health food.
Exactly.
Also, not to be measured in that is the rapeseed oil that they have.
Yes.
Alongside that.
Yes.
Anyway, I digress. I just wanted to point out how fucking ridiculous that stuff is.
So what's so interesting about this for me is that I recently got my blood work. We talked about my LDL. My HDL was 90, by the way. And my fasting insulin was less than 3 milli-IU per liter. And
triglycerides were what?
108. And my C-peptide was 0.58. So if anyone believes that eating 100 to 150 grams of honey per day is making me insulin resistant, you're going to have a tough time making that argument with an insulin of less than 3 as a fasting insulin.
And it's been a couple months. How long?
Oh, it's been 5 months now.
Okay.
And the cramping has gotten so much better. I don't get palpitations anymore. I feel good. And check this out. I got a new ketone monitor from Keto Mojo. Shout out to those guys. And my ketones are 0.5 in the morning. So I'm in ketosis when I wake up in the morning. So this is why I think that like both can be true and valuable, that our ancestors almost certainly had ketones in their blood very frequently. Right. Very frequently.
Are you going to take it out seasonally?
Am I going to take it out what?
Seasonally? Honey? And maybe like in the wintertime, go low honey? Or are you going to keep it just consistent?
You know, I said that would be an interesting experiment. It would be seasonal to do that. Maybe. I like the way honey feels now, but it probably makes sense to do some period of time with no carbs and then go back to having carbs and then no carbs, go back to having carbs. For me, 1.5 years was too long. And,
yeah, for sure.
And I think that most people I hear from and listen to get this. Like they feel really good in the beginning and then they start to get cramps. And at that point, that's when you should reincorporate carbohydrates, I believe. And you can do it cyclically. You don't have to do massive amounts, but I think your human physiology needs an insulin spike, which is not going to give you insulin resistance. That is not what causes insulin resistance. I feel very strongly that carbohydrates do not cause insulin resistance, but it's the polyunsaturated fatty acids, this linoleic acid, that are breaking metabolism, and we can talk about this. And that in the setting of a broken metabolism from excess polyunsaturated fatty acids, carbohydrates fan the flames of that. So in your case, I'm super curious to see if your tolerance of things like honey gets better over time. Because I don't know, I imagine you have not had lots of linoleic acid in your body frequently, but have you actually looked at like an RBC level of linoleic acid? No. You can do this pretty easily. And I do it in my clients. So you can do what's called an omega check, and they'll show you your omega-3s, which I'm actually less interested in than your linoleic acid. And my linoleic acid was like less than 18% in the RBC. You can also check levels of fatty acids in your blood, though they're a little more transient. But short of a fat biopsy, I think an RBC linoleic acid level can tell you a lot. I've had clients as low as 16 or 17 and as high as 30%. Now, the reference range, which is just based on the standard deviation and the population norm with the Gaussian curve, is I think anywhere from 18 to 29. So it's just an interesting data point that I've started to gather on people. It would be interesting to track your linoleic acid levels. And the other piece of this is that there's some data to suggest humans don't make polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is why they are, quote, essential. But I think that we are over consuming polyunsaturated fatty acids of all types, both omega-3 and omega-6. And they accumulate in our tissues. There's some evidence that the half-life of these fatty acids is more than a year, potentially a year and a half to 2 years. So this means that somebody that has insulin resistance related to excess linoleic acid or has a lot of linoleic acid, it's going to take them a year plus to really efflux that linoleic acid out of the membrane. Now, I haven't done this experiment with my clients, but I have one client, like I said, who has a linoleic acid of 30. And I'm going to keep checking his linoleic acid over the year. He was eating a lot of pork, incidentally. And I think he may have been eating a lot of vegetable oil. And I said, get rid of that stuff. Stop it. But it would be interesting in your case. It's a hypothesis. I wonder if, for some reason, your linoleic acid is too high. And that over time, as you replace linoleic acid with stearic acid or palmitic acid or even monounsaturates that your body wants in the membrane rather than linoleic acid, that your glucose tolerance might improve.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I tell people all the time with cheap meals, things like that, going out to restaurants. Like, oh, it's just whatever. If you eat vegetable oils and things high in PUFA, you're living with that decision for up to 2 years. It's wild. 2 years.
Remember when we went to that restaurant in Salt Lake?
Yeah, that was pretty amazing. We did our own investigation. You can always ask what people use. Never take someone else's word for it. And always ask for yourself, right?
Yeah.
There's always so many confusing questions too. And it's like, hey, what do you cook with? It's oil. What kind of oil?
Vegetable oil.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Let me go check.
Canola. Yeah. Soybean.
Peanut.
Yeah.
Cottonseed.
Corn. Yeah. You don't want any of that. Horrible. Yeah. And even, I was talking to one of my clients yesterday. He said, Paul, I'm traveling across Canada. He's going to Saskatchewan, which is where Sasquatch lives, apparently. And he was like, what am I going to eat? And I was like, well, you can eat in a restaurant. If you get a burger, just ask them what they fry it in. A lot of times hamburgers are cooked in vegetable oil.
Yeah.
You go to McDonald's, ask them what they put on the grill to cook a hamburger. I mean, don't go to McDonald's, but I would be interested. It would be fun to do this. Maybe if I end up, I don't eat at food trucks. I generally eat 100% of my food here at home. But if I were going to go to a food truck or a restaurant, I would ask them, like, what do you cook your burger in? Or what do you cook your steak in? And a lot of times it's vegetable oil. And then you can say, oh, please don't do that. Right. Like, can you use tallow, or can you just wipe the grill clean or flat or dry?
It's in everything.
It is in everything.
Yeah. And especially like, even if they say, oh, we're using olive oil, many times olive oil sucks anyway. It's
with soybean oil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it's already oxidized itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just, the best thing is just to not eat liquid oils, in my opinion.
Yeah. Don't eat liquid oils. Don't cook in liquid oil. Why are you cooking in liquid oil? But if everybody wants to know, but what if I am? It's like when people ask me, what's the best alcohol to drink? Like, if you want to poison yourself, go poison yourself. Do it on your own time. Like, that's your quality of life decision. I don't care. Like, fine, drink vodka, because wine has lots of, mold toxins or sulfites. But it's like one of these questions, like, what's the least evil? And you're like, why are you making that decision in the first place? I don't drink alcohol. I'm not judging anyone who does. I don't do it for any reason other than the fact that I just don't feel like it serves me. That sounded judgmental. I apologize, guys. I'm not judging you guys who drink alcohol. It sounded very, very condescending. I just don't understand that. Like, they're like, what's the best alcohol? I'm like, it's all not good for you, right?
Yeah. But I'm more of a creator of bridges. I like to get people from one place to another. And so there's certainly ways to think about that. With oils, I like Casandrinos for olive oil. I just know their supply chain and I know the people who run the farm. It's a family farm. So for olive oil, if you want, people want to use that on salads or whatever, if they're going to eat salads, I think that's way better than.
Why would you eat a salad?
Again, creator of
bridges.
Creator of bridges here.
You're teaching me.
Yeah, I mean, it's just there's obviously a million different ways we can do this. But like, it's hard to trust. It's hard to trust brands. And when there's reports come out, when 82% of avocado oil is soybean oil, it's wild. It's why, regardless, I think that we can always agree on like eat food from sources that you know the producer, where you can go see the operation. You know, go find farms around you. I mean, I always talk about eat wild, local harvest is good, farmers market directory, but like go search to see what's around you. Go to farmers markets. And even if you're eating plants there, I think that you may disagree with me, obviously, but like that's so much better than eating anything from a grocery store, even if it is a Whole Foods or somewhere like a big box chain.
I completely agree with you there. And I've said this repeatedly that I think that eating plants locally sourced is way better than eating any standard processed American food. Right. I even tweeted about that today. I think a plant-based diet is way better than the standard American diet. But
well, it just depends. It depends like what foods those
exactly.
are. Like one of my friends tweeted the other day, he's like, here's what else is plant-based besides Oatly. Cocaine, heroin, like snake venom, like these things, like I guess not snake venom, maybe an animal thing, but like all of these things are like tobacco and cigarettes and like plant-based and Impossible burgers, like these things.
Exactly.
It doesn't like if you're actually like we need a new name for eating actual plants.
Well, it's like Whole Foods plant-based, right? Yeah. And we sometimes will say Whole Foods animal-based, just because I don't think people should be eating hot dogs on a carnivore diet, or I don't think people should be doing tons of hot dogs. I don't think you should be eating Spam on a carnivore diet. That's what gives it the bad name. Like, oh, I can eat a carnivore diet. I can eat Spam every day. No. We're talking Whole Foods animal-based or Whole Foods plant-based. And I think a Whole Foods plant-based diet is way better than the standard American diet, but it's going to lead to nutrient deficiencies. And I hope you're not doing a Whole Foods plant-based diet because you believe red meat to be bad for you based on very misleading epidemiology with, ignorance toward the interventional studies that show that it's incredibly healthy for you.
Read Carnivore Code book, read Sacred Cow, go support local farms, keep the money in your economy, keep it local, be healthy. It's not that complicated.
Thrive, enjoy your life. You're only here for 70 to 120 years.
Unless you're one of the tech bros thinking we're going to upload ourselves.
Right,
then we don't need to worry about nutrition at all.
Right.
Let's wait for the singularity.
Yeah, the universe is around for 50 billion. We're here for a blink of an eye. None of us is really that impactful. It's just about getting the highest quality of life, playing with your kids, having valuable experience with your friends and family, and doing something you feel like is meaningful.
So I just try to simplify stuff. Like it's so hard to actually be healthy and do all of the things that you need to do. If you just think about everything from like your local community, start with yourself, focus on yourself, then go from there. Get your food local, have friendships that are local, get off the internet, eat food that grows around you. You're going to solve like 85% of your issues.
If not 95.
Right.
You'll solve most of the issues, And I think there is nuance though, like we're talking about. Be careful about the chicken, be careful about the pork, be careful about the sourcing, but that's really what it's about. And it's interesting to talk about the science because it helps people understand what the real enemies are. And I've been really vocal about this recently on my social media, as we begin to tie a bow on this whole thing that, like carbs aren't the enemy. I think carbs are the enemy when they replace the majority of your calories that could be coming from nutrient-dense animal foods. So I think that one of the biggest benefits of low-carb diets is that they allow you so much more space to have nutrient-rich foods like animal foods in your diet. How anyone eating 55% of their calories from carbohydrates gets enough micronutrients is a freaking calculus problem that I cannot solve. It's impossible. I actually don't believe you can eat a healthy diet with your carbohydrates above 30%. I think that the only way to get the micronutrients you need is to eat a quote low carbohydrate diet with around 20 to 30% of your calories or less from carbs. Now, interestingly, as we were talking about, I just want to make it clear to people that I don't think carbohydrates cause diabetes in and of themselves. There's lots of good anthropology to support that. The Tucacinta, people eat like 90% of their calories from carbs, no diabetes, ketavins, et cetera, et cetera. It's been shown over and over. They're not eating processed carbs. They're just eating, starches and stuff. Some of them even eat a lot of fruit. And so that's important to know that eliminating carbohydrates in the short term can be very good. But there's another piece there, and I think it's the vegetable oils, and I don't want people to miss that as well.
Right. Stop eating vegetable oils. That's the main thing.
And animals fed corn and soy.
Yeah, it's terrible. All right, Paul. Well, I'm grateful to have you here locally finally. And some sharp people soon. We have a lot of people. I think of 12 people who are moving here in the next 3 months. It's wild. One of our friends moving here next weekend.
It's amazing. Party time.
So
We'll take him to Float Lab. We'll take him to Ocean Lab.
you have you said Heart and Soil, the book re-release coming out. Why don't you tell people where they can find this?
Yeah, so super exciting stuff. I think this podcast will be out the first week of August, in which I've got all kinds of cool stuff happening. Heart and Soil, sort of the company into which I'm putting a lot of passion by creating these desiccated organ supplements, is releasing heartandsoilsupplements.com. And so we're desiccating low temperature dehydrating organs from New Zealand sourced cattle now that are regeneratively raised, and in the future, a US based supply chain. We're going to launch with beef organs and bone marrow and liver. And like I said, we've got Firestarter coming soon, which is a high stearic acid sort of tallow. And we've got all kinds of good stuff coming in the works there. So heartandsoilsupplements.com. My book, The Carnivore Code, was
V2, baby.
V2. So the second edition of The Carnivore Code comes out August the 4th, thecarnivorecodebook.com. And it's my thesis, my baby, just a lot of my ideas in one place with a lot of references around a lot of the ideas we talked about today and many others, just really trying to exonerate meat and create a spectrum of toxicity for plants and help people realize that if they're not thriving, there are other options out there. thecarnivorecodebook.com. Our hope is that it reaches a lot of people and affects a lot of lives positively. Yeah. And overall, my website is carnivoremd.com.
And I have a signed copy of V2 that I'm going to throw on eBay for the highest bidder.
Sweet.
So good luck.
For the highest bidder.
All right, Paul. Thanks, man.
Dude, it's so good to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.